Well, good evening, everybody, and greetings from Town Hall Europe, the Friends of Europe Conference Centre here in Brussels. I'm Jamie Shea, Senior Fellow of Friends of Europe, and it's going to be my pleasure to be the moderator for tonight's debate and discussion on Arctic security. Just a few months ago, I was in this same room, which was then full of people, when Paul Taylor, my colleague as the Senior Fellow here, introduced his last study, which at that time was on transatlantic defence industrial cooperation. Tonight, because of COVID, unfortunately, I'm here nearly all by myself, although with my excellent technical support team from Friends of Europe. But at least I could see already on the screen online many familiar faces, many of you who would have been here. And of course, the advantage of online is that I'm also able to see many of you from far away who could not have been here physically, but have found, as I have, this topic sufficiently interesting to join us. So a warm welcome to all of you, to our speakers, of course, first and foremost. I'll introduce those in a moment, but all of you as participants. This is going to be an interactive session, so start thinking about questions and comments, and I shall turn to you as soon as possible to join the discussion. Now, after Paul finished his last study for us in his series looking at national and regional security perspectives on Europe and transatlantic issues, we asked Paul not to go west, but to go north, up to the Arctic. This is a cold region, but it's been hotly debated in recent times. There's been a debate on the impact of the Arctic on the global warming and climate change situation, or should I say vice versa, the impact of climate change on the Arctic itself. Is it a potential new El Dorado for hydrocarbons and minerals and rare earth extraction? Is it a new transport hub for the global economy? Is it a new flashpoint for geostrategic competition and rivalries, with the prospect even there of future military clashes? And if all of these things are going on, what is their impact on the indigenous populations? Are all these things making their lives better or worse? So a couple of months ago, we asked Paul here at Friends of Europe to train his sophisticated and highly experienced journalist's eye on Arctic security. We asked him to separate the hype from the reality, the facts from all of the predictions, to tell us what is really going on up there, and also to give us a sense of what role the regional actors, the international institutions are playing in this respect. So, Paul, thank you for producing your latest work. It's called After the Ice, a study of Arctic security. By the way, for everybody who is online this evening, be aware that this will be available on the Friends of Europe website immediately after our meeting today, so please access it and please read it. So I'm going to first of all ask Paul to take us through the main findings and conclusions of his report. Thereafter, I'm going to turn to our four distinguished panelists who have joined us today to comment. I'll introduce them one by one. And once we've heard from them, we will turn to you, dear participants, for your questions and discussion. So, Paul Taylor, Senior Fellow, Friends of Europe, you are not in the high north this evening, you're more in the deep south, at least in the south of France, but think Arctic, and please present us the findings of your study. Paul Taylor, over to you. Where is Paul? Well, he's definitely here because we had him up with us on the screen just a few moments ago, so we will hopefully rapidly get him back. There he is. There he is. Paul, you had me nervous for a moment there.
Yes, I think I got unmuted and then remuted. Thank you, Jamie, and thanks to our international panelists. It's a terrible pity that we can't hold this discussion in Friends of Europe's splendid Town Hall Europe conference room and then all repair for a drink or two and dinner afterwards. But in COVID times, I guess, as Jack Nicholson would have said, this is as good as it gets. My study After the Ice, the Arctic and European Security, examines the growing geopolitical tensions in and over the Arctic. And it tries to provide a reality check, as Jamie said, on the assumptions on which these tensions are based. I analyze the underlying political, economic, and military drivers of great power competition in the high north. I identify 5 potential flashpoints for incidents that might escalate. And I also note the perhaps bigger risk that a conflict that began elsewhere, for example in the Baltic or in the Black Sea region, might spread to the Arctic. Finally, I offer some recommendations for how to preserve a low-tension environment in the high north in the years to come. Now, you'll also find a couple of annexes with a timeline of strategic events in the Arctic and an analysis of the main protagonists' Arctic strategy documents, some of which are currently being updated. Well, sadly, due to the coronavirus, as Jamie said, I wasn't actually able to travel to the Arctic region for my research this time. I do have stark memories, however, of the region from when I flew to Iceland in midwinter as a defense correspondent for Reuters during the Cold War. In the mid-1980s, I was aboard a low-flying Dutch NATO submarine hunting plane, scanning the waves for Soviet submarines. Well, we're not quite back to the Cold War yet, but Arctic waters are certainly busier today than at any time since the fall of the Berlin Wall. To spare you waiting till the end, I would say that my overall conclusion is that much of what is written about a looming high noon in the high north, or a scramble for hydrocarbons, minerals, and new shipping routes is greatly exaggerated, sometimes wildly so. As far as I can tell, the Arctic's economic prospects are sadly far less dazzling, and the risks of conflict are probably less acute than is often suggested. Nevertheless, there are increasing tensions between Russia and the West over Chinese ambitions in the region, and due to US efforts to project its global rivalry with Beijing onto the Arctic, that need to be carefully watched, managed, and if possible, dialed down. In the report, I quote Ulf Sverdrup, the director of the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs, as saying that the Arctic's a bit like an Ibsen play, where a dysfunctional family with lots of dark secrets is just about getting along until an outsider arrives and triggers a traumatic process of conflict and revelation. That outsider, he suggested, is China. Well, certainly there's quite a lot of conflict and revelation coming out at the moment. Jamie?
Well, Paul, what would you think would be the sort of key triggers then that you would be looking at that could tip a peaceful situation into a potentially more contentious or even more violent one? What kind of triggers were you looking at in this study?
Well, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that I think that conflict in the Arctic is likely, but there are flashpoints that need to be watched. And we'll look at those. I identify 5. One is a possible American challenge in the name of freedom of navigation to Russia's control of the emerging Arctic Sea Route, what the Russians call the Northern Sea Route, running from the Bering Strait to the Kola Peninsula, which is home of Moscow's Northern Fleet and its crucial nuclear submarine force. Another possibility is differences between Russia and Norway over the application of the Svalbard Treaty, which governs the strategically located Norwegian Arctic archipelago, and the rights of other signatories, including Moscow, on the islands. There are disputes which were set out in a letter of complaint by the Russian foreign minister to Norway on the 100th anniversary of the Svalbard Treaty. And one could imagine that issues over fishing, over oil and gas prospection, or possibly over Russian mining on the island, the presence of Russian citizens, and so on, overflights, all of these could potentially be unsettling. A third possibility is what Harold Macmillan would have called events, dear boy, events. An accident at sea or an environmental disaster, whether it involved merchant shipping, a military vessel, a cruise ship perhaps, or leakage of nuclear waste or major oil pollution. You know, in all of these situations, there are some agreements as to who does what, but there's a big shortage of search and rescue capability and a risk that this could turn sour. Then, of course, there are hybrid or cyber attacks, not, of course, confined to the Arctic, but we've seen them in the Arctic, notably during the NATO's big Trident Juncture exercise in 2018 in the Arctic. And that, of course, could always lead to an accident, to damage. For example, if NATO naval vessels were to collide because their GPS systems had been jammed or spoofed, or an aircraft were to crash, or something went wrong in a military exercise because of that kind of electronic interference. Finally, I think there's the issue of Greenland's quest for independence from the Kingdom of Denmark. It's not exactly a hot button issue now, but it's something which is lurking there, not far below the surface. And it could escalate, possibly involving Chinese investments in major development projects on the sparsely populated and strategically located island. The Greenlanders need new revenue sources in order to go for independence, and they're not getting much investment from either the United States or Europe. So, you know, the Chinese checkbook diplomacy has perhaps an opening there. And while none of these events seems likely in itself to be a probable trigger for armed conflict, the fact that Russia has so many of its vital military assets concentrated in the Kola Peninsula, close to northern Norway and Finland, means there's always a possibility that a standoff elsewhere could lead to escalation in the Arctic Circle. So one such scenario, which I know keeps NATO's strategists busy, is the possibility of a border incident or a military buildup around the Baltic states, Kaliningrad or elsewhere in Eastern Europe, that might prompt the supreme Allied commander in Europe, usually a four-star American general, to recommend peacetime reinforcement of NATO's eastern flank. That in turn could prompt Russia to decide to deploy the Northern Fleet into the Barents Sea in the direction of the Norwegian Sea and the North Atlantic, putting them within missile range of key transport hubs in Western Europe that would be essential for NATO's transatlantic reinforcement. And then what?
Well, Paul, that is the key question. Then what? I know that, Paul, every time you do one of these studies, you like to come up with a number of conclusions and policy recommendations, particularly for the policy-making community here in Brussels. So what are you advocating this time round? What do we need to take away as the key lessons and conclusions from the study?
Well, in terms of security, I would argue that the Arctic ain't bust and doesn't need a radical fix. It's still a region of relatively low tension and of substantial intergovernmental cooperation, even where such cooperation has broken down in other parts of Europe or the world. But it could use more dialogue and confidence building. And this report suggests how to do that by building on the existing instruments, such as the Arctic Council, by restoring and expanding military-to-military dialogue, and where possible by using track 2 diplomacy, perhaps under the aegis of the Munich Security Conference, to develop greater transparency and some rules of the road, a polar military code of conduct, if you like. My other major conclusion, I would say, is that the greatest threat to and from the Arctic is climate change, not a military buildup. You know, ice savers will be far more important to the survival of humanity and to international security than icebreakers. The Arctic Council should be used more intensively to agree on measures to drastically reduce black carbon emissions that are accelerating the sort of vicious cycle of Arctic warming. The prospects for economic development in the Arctic, I conclude, are actually far less rosy than has been assumed for a decade or so. The post-COVID reality is quite a lot darker. There's less investment around. There's less demand, at least for now, for energy, for fossil fuels. And despite the rapidly melting ice, Arctic sea routes, in fact, and I've talked to all the world's major shipping companies for this report, offer no alternative to the great commercial shipping arteries, the Suez Canal, the Panama Canal, the Strait of Malacca, and so on, at least for the next 20 to 30 years. Most of the Arctic's huge oil and gas reserves cannot be extracted profitably, especially the offshore deposits, and they're likely to remain in the ground or under the sea as global hydrocarbon demand peaks earlier than had been previously forecast due to the impact of COVID. Melting permafrost will actually make it harder, not easier, to extract rare earth minerals and to build transport infrastructure. Arctic tourism, which was seen as a lifesaver, particularly for Iceland, perhaps for Greenland, will struggle to return to pre-COVID levels, if it ever does. I don't see anybody much wanting to take an Arctic cruise in the near future. Perhaps the brightest economic prospect, I think, lies in a radical improvement in Arctic digital connectivity, if it can be achieved via low Earth orbit satellite constellations and intercontinental cables. But there too, geopolitics may be an obstacle. Attempts to build an Arctic Connect cable, for example, from northern Finland and northern Norway to the Far East face American pressure over the potential role of Huawei.
And Paul, what about the role of Russia and China in all of this?
Well, yes, looking at the great powers, because increasingly the Arctic is being shoehorned into this, I would say, somewhat distorting prism of great power rivalry, seen especially from Washington. Russia is the dominant incumbent power in the region. It's got the longest Arctic coastline. It's been in the region for centuries, and in fact, its northern regions are less militarized today than they were in the days of the Soviet Union. Russia, I think, has an opportunity to build a cooperative future in the Arctic when it takes the chair of the Arctic Council next May in 2021-22. It could perhaps even host a first Arctic Council summit, provided, and this is a big if, it is willing to change course in Ukraine and to dial down the provocative military actions in the High North and the Baltic, which are, causing such irritation for Nordic countries and the UK as well. China's presence in the Arctic, I would say, has been greatly exaggerated. Frankly, you have to look with a microscope to find it. To be sure, Beijing is looking for ways in through infrastructure investments and scientific research, not militarily that anybody can see. Its main move has been to invest in Russia's Yamal liquefied natural gas project to help meet its own domestic energy needs. But it's actually had very little success elsewhere in the European or North American Arctic. It's invested relatively little money and expended pretty small political capital compared to the Great Eurasian Belt and Road Initiative. And faced with pushback in the West, it's noticeable that China has, at least for now, stopped calling itself a near Arctic state and stopped talking so much about a polar Silk Road. I suspect that with COVID forcing countries to be more selective about their investments, China is going to have to dial down also its interest in the Arctic for a while.
Paul, you've got exactly 1 minute left, so presumably you want to say a few words about the United States and the EU, and then we'll go to our panel.
Here we go. The Trump administration, in contrast, total contrast to its predecessor, has downplayed climate change, as we know, and viewed the Arctic almost exclusively through the distorting lens of its global rivalry with China. The next US administration, I would argue, whichever party forms it, needs to rebalance Arctic policy towards fighting global warming and promoting sustainable investment. Yes, Washington and NATO should prudently enhance their military vigilance towards Russia, as they've been doing in the last few years, but without acting provocatively. And they also need to keep China's relatively modest Arctic role in perspective. As for Europe, well, the European Union has no formal status in the Arctic, and its role is limited both by Russian opposition and in part by the lack of strong support for a bigger EU role, even among its own Arctic member states, with perhaps the exception of Finland. Nevertheless, I think the EU can play a useful supporting role in climate mitigation, in sustainable development, and improving the conditions of indigenous peoples in the Arctic who are so severely hit by climate change. The EU should update its Arctic strategy, including the security dimension for the first time, the need for critical raw materials. It was striking. They produced a document last week on how the EU is going to diversify its supplies of critical raw materials. They didn't even mention Greenland. And through ways of promoting sustainable economic development. Given the discomfort that I think European Arctic states feel under pressure from Washington to take sides against Russia and China in a sort of zero-sum contest, the opportunity for the EU and its for European members to play a balancing role may be growing.
Okay, Paul, thanks very much for taking us through the study, and particularly for giving us quite a comprehensive set of punchy policy recommendations. We'll see immediately now what our four distinguished panelists make of your analysis, your insights, and above all, your recommendations. Do they agree with what you've said, Paul? Do they think you've got it right? Do they have particular questions for you? I'm going to introduce them in turn and ask them individually to comment. And we're very glad and grateful to have four such distinguished experts with us this evening. First, we have Tony Skogen, who is the State Secretary in the Ministry of Defence of Norway, so obviously a key country for the region, already of course highlighted by Paul. The State Secretary was also State Secretary in the Foreign Ministry before moving to the Ministry of Defence. He also has a very strong track record in dealing with the energy security issues, Paul, that you pointed to. State Secretary, again, thank you so much for being part of this afternoon, this evening. If you have your comments, we want to hear them now. And as I said, if you have particular questions for Paul, then Paul can try to deal with them later on when I give him the chance for some concluding remarks. So over to you, State Secretary. A warm welcome. Please unmute.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Perfectly, loud and clear.
Thank you. Hello, everyone, and thank you both for the possibility to participate on the panel, and also thank you for the very timely publication of the report on Arctic security. Let me start by sort of, I guess, repeating that one of the report's conclusions, that there is no new, so to speak, great game in the Arctic. And indeed, I could not agree more. Discussions of Arctic security need to move beyond that particular myth. To some, focusing on the Arctic may be new. To Norway, the High North has always been front and center of our security policy. And Russia has always been in focus. And now we also need to watch China's evolving policies and activities in the north as well. Our key goal is maintaining the High North as an area characterized by predictability and stability. The report focuses on international cooperation and the rule of law as keys to a peaceful Arctic. This is a view we wholeheartedly share. And I will focus my initial comments on NATO in the north, military presence in the Arctic, and the need for dialogue, transparency, and confidence building. The report states that it is unclear how far north NATO's area of responsibility stretches. But that is not at all unclear. NATO's area of responsibility goes all the way to the North Pole. To us, it is hard to agree with the description of NATO's posture in the report. It is not true that NATO is largely absent in the Arctic. We are a NATO member, and a significant part of our territory and our maritime areas lie north of the Arctic Circle. When we sail and fly in the north, this is also something we do on behalf of the alliance. The Norwegian Air Force has provided permanent 24/7 NATO air policing from their Arctic air base in Bodø for the past 60 years. Identifying and intercepting Russian aircraft coming from the bases on the Kola Peninsula is one of the most crucial missions of the Norwegian armed forces in the high north. Moreover, our maritime patrol aircraft are regularly patrolling the Barents Sea, providing situational awareness to the transatlantic security community. We have performed this task in cooperation with close allies since the Russian Northern Fleet started their Cold War patrols into the Atlantic. And the North Atlantic continues to play a strategic role for Allied security. It also remains one of the most important patrol areas for Russian submarines. The report is correct that NATO does not have a glossy brochure laying out its Arctic strategy. What we have is collective defense. We have NATO defense plans and the political and military determination and ability to prove our commitment. NATO's adaptation to the needs of the new security situation, establishing JFC Norfolk and the Second Fleet, is testament to the alliance's continued emphasis on deterrence and defense. I have already laid out Norway's contribution to regional stability and allied security by operating in and monitoring the Arctic region. But we also need allied presence in the north. Lately, we have seen an increased allied interest in operating in the region, largely as a reaction to increased Russian assertiveness, military modernization, and power projection in the Arctic. Allied overflights and maritime activity is an important sign of the strategic importance of the region. It demonstrates Allied will and ability to deter and defend against any aggression in the Arctic. And this is something we welcome. In fact, right now in the high north, a Norwegian frigate is supporting vessels and aircraft from the US, UK, and Denmark in their operations. Interoperability in Arctic conditions is crucial. I noted that the report recommends establishing a NATO-enhanced forward presence battalion in northern Norway. Norway supports the EFP initiative, but we do not see the need for such allied presence in northern Norway. We have an active invitational policy, close cooperation with our allies, and extensive allied training and exercise activity. A high level of allied activity demonstrates commitment and readiness to engage if required. Finally, let me end by repeating Norway's strong support for confidence-building measures and dialogue. Particularly today, having functional channels of military communication is vital. But we should not use the Arctic Council for that. In fact, keeping the Arctic Council as a forum for cooperation in non-security matters is what makes it such a great contribution to security in the Arctic. We need to reduce the risk of a race for Arctic resources, becoming a competition that fuels conflict in the North. This is also why we need to use the existing fora to preserve a rules-based approach to international cooperation in the Arctic. So let me close with those comments, and I thank you again and look forward to hopefully a very interesting and fruitful panel debate. Thank you.
Thanks to you, State Secretary, first of all, for giving us such a detailed expose, not just of the Norwegian position, but also of the NATO position as well. So you covered two areas. Very, very grateful for that. Thank you also for giving us frank feedback on Paul's ideas. It's, as you know, the job of think tankers to come up with all kinds of fancy ideas, but it's the job of you, the policymakers and the senior political leadership, to tell us if those ideas make sense or not. But you at least have concluded that Paul's analysis is very much on the right track. That's very heartening. Again, it was great to hear from you. And now I'm going to turn to our second speaker, Michael Mann. But before I do so, I probably should have said this at the beginning, but I assume, dear participants, that all of you have done so many thousands of webinars and Zooms and Teams over the last couple of months that you don't need me to tell you that if you wish to ask a question and you're on Zoom, then give us your full name and raise your hand. Or if you're following, of course, on live stream or the Twitter feed, then go to the hashtag FOE debate. And as I've said, we'll take note of your desire to come in, and I promise to give you the opportunity. So please start doing that so we're all ready for the discussion. And now I go to the second of our speakers, panelists tonight, Michael Mann. He's a very well-known figure on the Brussels scene, senior EU official. But the last couple of years, Michael, you've specialised very much in the High North as EU ambassador to Iceland, and now in your current role as the EU Special Envoy for Arctic matters. Paul had a few thoughts about the EU role and recommendations, and you're the best person to get the best possible response to what he had to say. Again, great to see you, Michael. Thanks for joining us. Over to you now.
Well, thanks very much to you, Jamie. Thanks very much to Friends of Europe for setting up this excellent event today and for the excellent report. And I have to say thanks to Paul, chapeau to Paul, because it really is an excellent report. Extremely impressive work, and he's really talked to everybody that needs to be spoken to on this issue. Also, thanks to the staff at Friends of Europe for making this work technically as well. I know it's not always easy. My first starting point is that the Arctic has been and remains an area of low tension and peaceful cooperation, despite tensions elsewhere in the world. That is the thing that is of most importance to the European Union. That has been our position, that is what we want to see the Arctic as an area of low tension and cooperation. We are, it has to be said, seeing signs of new dynamics. This is largely, I think, because of posturing and problems elsewhere, but there is some evidence that it is also playing out in the Arctic regions themselves. But again, and I suppose it won't surprise you to hear this from the European Union representative, from our perspective, the clear and present danger that we all face, as Paul said, is the disastrous effects, the potential disastrous effects of climate change. And that could also, of course, be a trigger for security concerns further down the road. We've seen ridiculous temperatures. We saw 38 degrees in Russian Siberia. We saw Svalbard up at 21 degrees. We've seen wildfires. We've seen, of course, the big diesel fuel leak in Russia caused by the thawing of permafrost. So that is, for us, the big danger that we face. As I said, it could be a trigger for security concerns. For us, again, security and safety goes much wider than purely the question of hard security. This could be a fishing boat, a cruise ship, an LNG tanker, a submarine getting into trouble, linked to the very limited search and rescue capacity that there is in these vast regions up in the Arctic. Obviously, climate change effects can trigger issues of environmental health, social and economic security, among others. And I mentioned already the thaw of permafrost, which has been something that has really been to the fore recently. So that is why, from our perspective, in amongst all this talk of security and hard security, the big task for everybody is to deal with climate change and to take climate action seriously. Now, to get on specifically to what Paul said about the European Union, I'm pleased to say that we are working on an update to take account of the new realities, as Paul suggests in his report. We had the backing of the Council last December in some Council conclusions calling us to launch this process. We've had support in the European Parliament, and there's been a lot of discussion internally about what form this should take. I'll do a little bit of publicity now. We launched a public consultation back in July, which runs until November. We genuinely want to hear people's views on what we could be doing better, whether what we're doing at the moment is the right approach. So I would invite anybody who's interested to take part in that consultation. We're also doing our homework internally. Just to make a few comments about why is the EU even in the Arctic? Paul did raise the question. The EU is physically in the Arctic on account of the fact that 3 of its member states are Arctic states. We are a major consumer of Arctic resources, whether it be hydrocarbons or fish. We have an effect on the Arctic through our industrial activity, and of course, we are, now making the Green Deal the big priority for the coming years, once obviously taking account of what's happened with COVID. And we are now under a geopolitical commission. So we are present, we are there, we have an effect on the Arctic. The Arctic has the melting in the Arctic has a very great effect upon us. And we should also say that in the European Arctic, and not just in Finland, the Kingdom of Denmark and Sweden, but also in Iceland and Norway, our legislation has a direct effect on the Arctic. So we are working on this update. We are determined in the EU to help enhance environmental, economic, and human resilience in the Arctic. And we are keenly aware that Arctic indigenous peoples are particularly worried about what is happening. And we have made it a point to take very, very seriously their views. Having said all this, that we don't believe that the sort of hard security is the major challenge we face, it's important not to be complacent. Strategic competition in the Arctic is a reality. We've seen a lot of activity recently. The EU, of course, always favors the rule of law, international cooperation. So if there were to be any talk of a discussion forum on security issues, we would lend that our very strong support. I think I'll stop there. I probably talked for too long, as is my wont. I just wanted to congratulate you, Friends of Europe, and Paul on the excellent quality of this report. Thank you.
Michael, thanks very much. Very succinct, but very interesting. A question that I would have at the back of my mind is that you mentioned, of course, that 3 EU members are also Arctic states. Many of the others, of course, are not. So to what degree do you find it's easy to interact with countries like Norway, Iceland, Canada, the United States, of course, beyond that, Russia, in developing an EU Arctic policy? I'm going to put that one to you just so to have a very quick break before we go to the next 2 speakers. And let me also, dear audience, ask if anybody at this stage among your ranks would like to come in also. That way we can just have a quick Q&A break, and then I'll turn to our next 2 speakers before the general Q&A session. Michael, do you want to take that one on from me, and then I'll see if anybody else has put their hand up?
Yes. Well, to be honest, I've been in this job since the beginning of April, and I've been surprised personally about how much the EU actually does in the Arctic. It was a surprise to me. We are extremely active in the Arctic in a number of areas. I mean, looking at just issues like science and research, we're incredibly active in the Arctic. But what I've also been very surprised about is the very good relations and very warm reception that we've had from other interlocutors in the Arctic. I don't think anyone thinks, oh dear, this is the EU meddling in things that aren't its business. I think we are generally seen as a force for good, as having good intentions in the Arctic. We take great pride, of course, in being kind of the global leaders in the fight against climate change. And, in all of my contacts across the board with people in all the Arctic states, not only our own ones, but also Canada, America, and so forth, we have been extremely warmly received. And I think that the Arctic is an example, despite all the talk of tensions and growing problems, it is an example of an area in the world where cooperation on a very practical level works very well. Now, we're not official observers of the Arctic Council, but we are basically allowed and able, thanks to the good offices of the members of the Arctic Council, to take a very good part in the work of the Arctic Council. We're very active in a lot of the working groups and task forces. A good example is the task force on black carbon, where our scientific expertise and our financial assistance has been greatly welcomed. So, the welcome I have received in the 5 months I've been doing this job has been extremely positive.
Michael, thanks very much. Now we have Gun-Britt Retter from the Sami Council, who has raised her hand. So we will unmute you, Gun-Britt, and please come in. Your question, if it's directed to anybody in particular, then please also make that clear. We could see you, so hopefully you could hear us. So please go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you so far for the presentations, both from the of the report and the two panelists so far. It is great to hear that climate change is a greater concern than the hard security issues. But I would ask if the participants wouldn't consider that nature, with climate change and the actions taken to address climate change, wouldn't loss of nature be an even greater concern than climate change itself, and climate change being only part of the big picture of nature loss? And this would be in line with what the Intergovernmental Panel on Ecosystem-Based Ecosystem Services concluded in their global assessment in May 2019. Thank you.
Thank you. That's obviously a very interesting, far-reaching question. I mean, State Secretary, you're in the Ministry of Defence now, so I don't know to what extent, of course, you deal specifically with climate change and nature loss, although I know that clearly you'll be thinking about the increasing interrelationship between climate change and security. That's even now coming onto the NATO agenda. So maybe you'll have a comment on that. Michael, you, of course, zoomed in on climate change immediately, so I will ask either the two of you if you'd like to respond to Gun-Britt's point and her question. And then I'll turn to our next panelist immediately thereafter. State Secretary Michael Mann, any thoughts on that question? State Secretary, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, good. Just a very quick comment. As you said, I'm now in defense, and of course I could only focus on a few issues of this fairly broad report. But in general, of course, I do agree with those arguing that maybe one of the basic issues regarding the Arctic is precisely the issues relating to climate change and nature loss, for that matter. And of course, this could also have an impact on the overall security agenda. So that's also something that both we in Norway, in NATO and other places were quite cautious about. But I do hope there is an understanding that I focused primarily on the security issues seen from a defense perspective.
Thank you, State Secretary. Michael Mann, any quick response, and then we'll carry on.
Thanks very much to Gun-Britt for the question. I mean, I would see the things as being linked. I wouldn't want to play down the issue of nature loss, which is of course a very great concern to us. I should underline that in our Arctic policy, the priority at the top of the list is we have three main priorities, but one of those is climate action and environmental protection. So I think the two are very much rolled into one. I tried to highlight climate change in my introductory remarks, really to sort of see it as a sort of a rallying call to everyone that this is something of much more importance perhaps than an assumption of sort of military tensions in the area. But we would take very clear note of what Gun-Britt says, and we would agree that biodiversity loss is an extreme issue that we are attempting to deal with in the best way that we can with our partners.
Thanks, Michael. And I would ask all of you participants to follow Gun-Britt's excellent precedent, and please come in now with your questions. Now, we move to our third panelist this evening. We get a perspective from North America with Mike Schrager, who is a very, very well-known specialist on the Arctic. I think he's devoted his career really to the region. He's currently the Director of Global Risk and Resilience, and he is with the Polar Institute at the Woodrow Wilson Center, a very well-known Washington think tank. Mike was also a big source, I know, for Paul Taylor when he was preparing his study. And also, I'm very proud and pleased to say that Mike is actually now joining us from Alaska. I suppose we had to have at least one of our speakers today up there in the Arctic to add a note of authenticity, dare I say, to our proceedings. So, Mike, it's great to see you. Really looking forward to your perspective. So, over to you, please.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction, and to the Friends of Europe for inviting me to speak with this distinguished panel, but to many of my friends and colleagues watching, and also to Paul. Congratulations on what I think is not just a good document. I think this will be a foundational document that many of us will refer to. I think it provides leadership, insight, guidance. The recommendations, I believe, have many paths that we could take to realize some of them. Some of them need to be in the short term. I believe some can be affected in the long term. But what you really have provided for me, and perhaps for many, is this arc of the Arctic. A phrase I had tried not to use often, but I think it fits well here. This arc of the Arctic from the bastion in Russia to the Bering Sea, a place as an Alaskan that I'm acutely aware of. Throughout North America, Alaska, Canada, Greenland, thinking Iceland and the GI-UK gap, and then bringing us to Scandinavia, the North Atlantic, and the Barents. So your report, although focused Europe, really drew to me the linkages in the Arctic, whether it's circumpolar or thinking quite more perhaps linear. But this arc of the Arctic, I think you've given it context. It's not just a North American or a Russian story or a Scandinavian story. This is a global story, and I think what you have done is provide linkages, just like I've most oftentimes tried to draw linkages from the South China Sea north all the way to the Bering Sea and then into the Arctic Circle. This, to me, does that. It puts Europe, the Arctic, North America in context. We've talked about climate. My good friend Wim Gilk mentioned climate. The State Secretary mentioned climate. Ambassador Mann mentioned climate. I thought of this report through these 7 filters, these 7 drivers that I think are primarily at play in the Arctic. It's called Navigating the Arctic 7 Seas. The first C is climate. Paul touches on that as a driver. Certainly commodities, he touches upon that. Commerce, the shipping of goods, connectivity, internet, and I'm speaking to you from an iPhone because my internet is down here in Alaska, so that's fitting. The communities that we serve, particularly the indigenous communities, are referenced here. This focus on cooperation, I think, needs to be paramount. It's linked to the other Cs, most importantly, as a driver of climate, and then the competition. So I've thought about through my framework, and Paul has hit all of those. So I think this is a foundational report. Paul, I think you provided balance to the Arctic narrative. 20 years ago or so, you couldn't get anybody to go to an Arctic meeting. Now, throw a dart and there's an Arctic meeting someplace on the calendar. So, but you've given context to this yin and yang, this competition between cooperation and competition in the Arctic. And I think you've set it in a really good place, providing reality to the Northern Sea Route versus the Suez Canal, the need for cooperation and the tyranny of distance for search and rescue versus a really hard focus on national security issues and conflict issues. I agree that I don't think conflict will happen in the Arctic. Conflict may occur in the Arctic because of something somewhere else. I'll get into that in a moment. I have 3 other points I'd like to make. One is I view the way other countries view the Arctic. I take that in a larger context. So without being pejorative to any country at all, and really without being pejorative at all, I think about a game analogy where you see the Russian Federation with a declining population, a reliance, perhaps over-reliance on natural resources, President Putin has put all of his Arctic eggs in one Arctic basket, perhaps, in the Sabeta plant and LNG resource development, taking Chinese investment there. But to me, in a game analogy, and again, not pejorative, they sort of play the game Survivor, just trying to invest, grow an economy, of course, always relevant as a great power, but nevertheless, they play the game Survivor here. To me, the Chinese, if you want to think about their role in the Arctic, they play the game Go, this long-term, geostrategic, very, very strategic in how they think about either the Arctic or Africa. And so they play the long-term game of Go. My own country, the United States, a global power, plays the game Twister. We have an arm and a leg almost everywhere in the world. And as a global power, that's the way it is. And we're stretched a bit in the United States because we put another circle on that twister mat, and it's called the opening of the Arctic Ocean. But I think Michael gives it some balance here, even though I think through these three countries in these three games, Survivor, Go, and Twister, again, not to be pejorative, but thinking about that, you put it into context, and the role of Europe and NATO and all of that. In terms of flashpoints, Paul very much teases out what I think are very valid flashpoints. But a flashpoint almost happened right here in Alaska just a week or so ago, along the border that we share with the Russian Federation, where a group of perhaps as many as 50 Russian Federation Navy ships, including a submarine that surfaced to make sure everyone saw it, along with aircraft, was operating in international waters more than 12 miles off the coast of Alaska, but yet ran into a conflict with a Pollock fleet that had the right to fish 200 nautical miles off the coast, and were warned to stay out of the area in which the Russian Federation was operating in their war games. Now, that could have gone very, very bad. In fact, those Pollock fishermen were quite surprised and scared. But those are the kind of flashpoints that we think about, at least I think about, and Paul has teased out this miscommunication or not reading the right signals, or really an incident that no one expected. So I don't think there'll be, as Paul noted, an event where we go to war over the Arctic. I think it's a miscommunication, not having the right comms in place, not understanding motive and motivation. Those are the kind of things that I think could happen in the North. The fourth and final point is Paul noted the need for military to military, whether it's formal or informal, and mentioned the Munich Security Conference. And I'd be remiss if I didn't, put a self-serving thumbs up to that. For the last 7 or 8 Munich Security Conferences, I've been honored to chair and facilitate the Arctic Security Roundtable. And that has been behind closed doors, of course, Chatham House rules. But that has been most productive and most telling for two reasons. One is there's an interest. There's an interest in keeping the tensions low. And you do that through high-level discussions. The second is an evolving and elevation of who attends those Arctic security roundtables at the highest levels, nations of all 8 Arctic states and non-Arctic states. And so I think the more that we can do, and very much open to continuing the dialogue, or perhaps arranging for and working with my friends at the Munich Security Conference on something along those lines, seems to make sense. It's a solid recommendation. And I will just leave it there and wait for questions and answers and further discussions. Thank you.
Mike, thanks very much. A very balanced perspective from the real expert, because you don't just sit in your office and study the region. You actually go out there and explore it directly. Mike, you have raised, I think, some issues. Number one, Paul mentioned in his report that maybe the salvation of the region was information technology, and your mobile phone, which has saved us this evening because the internet has gone down in Alaska, is probably a good way of underlining that. A couple of people would like to come in at this point. First of all, I recognize Andrew Budd, my very good colleague from NATO, in my case, ex-colleague. Andrew is always a regular on these occasions, and NATO has been mentioned quite a bit, so I'm very glad that he's going to come in now and give us a perspective from NATO HQ. Andrew, you're looking good. You're surviving lockdown, so over to you.
Jamie, thanks very much. It's good to see you, and this is a better connection on Zoom than the last time we tried to do, if you recall, with extra.
I remember well.
A quick question, if I may. And listening, really, it's been triggered by all, but mostly from what Mike has just said there. It is a question of how confident do the speakers feel that we can keep the Arctic as an area of low tension, given the military revisionism of Russia, given climate change, given China's increasing involvement, and we look to the fact they're building the world's biggest icebreaker, and nowhere else to take it other than the Arctic at the moment, and the potential environmental effects. So how much confidence is there that we can keep the lid on this without it blowing up?
Thanks, Andrew. As always, very pertinent question. Andrew, before I turn to the experts, maybe let's just take also a question from Ian Anthony, Deputy Director of SIPRI, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. Ian, I'm really delighted because you deal with this topic quite a lot, I know, in your own institute, so delighted to have you with us. So please put your question. And then Paul Taylor, I know you had a point to make. So let's just take these last two comments and then I'll turn again to our panellists before we also have the intervention of our final panelist this evening. Ian, good to see you.
Thanks so much for the opportunity. I hope you can hear me.
Very well.
Actually, I have a question for Mike and one for Tone, if that's permitted.
It is indeed, Ian.
For Mike, I'm very interested if you could elaborate on the local reaction in Alaska to what's happening. Alaska has a difficult economic situation that's not likely to get much better going forward, and investments from federal funds, including the military, presumably play an important role in the local economy. But it does put you more firmly in the crosshairs of this potential hard security dilemma. I'm just curious about how this plays out in the local discussion about the pros and cons of military investments in Alaska. And for Tone, I mean, we now put under the microscope in the current political environment every change that the US makes in its military posture. And we have the recent announcement that the Marines will change their schedule of exercises in Norway. And I just wonder if you could take the opportunity to just explain to us what happened, and how you see that.
Ian, thanks very much. Paul, if you permit, I'll turn to you a bit later on so that we have time for Katarzyna to have her intervention. You'll have things to say at the end. But we've had from Andrew and from Ian questions to Turner regarding military build-ups, the role of the US Marines. To Mike, a question about Alaska. So Turner, could I turn to you maybe to pick up those two questions that were to you directly? Over to you.
Yes, thank you. Let me start with the last one on the U.S. Marines. Well, of course, the U.S. Marines and the U.S. would be the most appropriate instance for asking the question. But I mean, as we see it, and that's the kind of opinion I can give you, and from the dialogue that we have had with our good U.S. friends, I mean, to start with saying there is nothing dramatic in this, quite the contrary. And this is a move that we absolutely welcome from a Norwegian point of view. What is happening is that instead of having a more or less permanent number of Marines training exercising in Norway, the US is now, call it modernizing or updating its organization. So there will be more of a, call it a periodic presence. There will be a certain base presence on a more permanent basis, but then they will bring in people for the exercises and for the training. And according to the plans that we have seen so far, there will actually be an increase in the exercise and the training in Norway, together with Norwegian troops. And this is, as I said, a development we very much welcome. And the fact that some of the material might also be removed is also a sign of modernizing, and this material that will be replaced with other materials. So basically, this is from the US as we see it and as we read it. A modernization, and it's a welcome adjustment to in their own organization. I guess for the first question, of course, it's always difficult, and we should be careful to give any kind of guarantees. But it's important to keep in mind that the Arctic and also the High North has been for a long time an area of peace and stability, and there is every reason to expect that this will also be the situation in the time then as many have alluded to, there are challenges. But I think the important thing that we need to do is to be aware of these challenges and to have good dialogues in the proper fora on these dialogues and meet the dialogues. And that's also one of the reasons why we are so keen to emphasize the need of transparency and openness and information. But I guess the bottom line is that we are rather confident that we will be able to maintain this area as an area characterized by peace and stability also in the time ahead.
Jonah, thanks very much indeed. Mike, quickly over to you in Alaska. You were asked a question about the place where you're currently residing, Ian's question. So could you pick that up for us briefly, please? And then I will thank Katarzyna for her patience and turn to her for her fourth intervention.
Thank you very much. It's good to see Ian. Greetings, Ian. It's good to be on the same program with you. Great question. Alaska has a long history of military presence, obviously, going way back, well over a century, especially since during World War II, the Alaska-Canadian Highway that linked Canada to Alaska and then the rest of the United States. Significant investments in the state of Alaska in the last decades, obviously since World War II. So Alaskans are quite comfortable. In fact, the highest proportion of veterans in the United States are in Alaska, fortunately. So we're very much used to this. The state relies on military investment. That's just a fact. Some basic infrastructure for the state comes from investments made by the military over the course of decades. What we see now is this quickening happening. It's like the quickening of the Arctic. New investments, F-35, most highest advanced fighters on the planet, are about 12 miles from my Fairbanks home here. We see investments in missile defense about 100 miles from my home, renovations in Eielson Air Force Base, Fort Wainwright in here in Fairbanks, Joint Base Elmendorf and Richardson in Anchorage, significant investments there. It has brought in money, resource, workforce to the state, not anything to balance the absolute plummeting of oil prices and the state's over-reliance on oil. Get about 80%, 85% of the income is generated somehow through oil extraction. So we look a lot like other countries, frankly, when it comes to our economy. I will also say that if you look at the National Defense Authorization Act, there is a lot of language in there, if it passes, bringing resource and capacity to the state of Alaska. The U.S. Air Force just released an Arctic strategy a few weeks ago. Alaska is dead center in that strategy. DOD, about 79% of their assets in the state of Alaska for the Arctic comes from the Air Force. So you will see more of that, including, or in addition to, the Army Corps of Engineers just releasing a report and recommending a brand new port, perhaps be built in Nome. That would be a dual-use port. That would be, could support military, Coast Guard, commerce, search and rescue. So a lot of opportunity for the state of Alaska, income-wise, but also in the national defense and national security region, including search and rescue and civil security.
Mike, thanks very much. No, indeed, that was an extremely detailed answer, and I hope that Ian was able to note down at speed all of the interesting points you made, but thank you for that. Now I'm going to pass the floor to our fourth panelist. Again, Katarzyna, thank you for waiting patiently, but we want very much to hear from you now, Professor Katarzyna Zisk. She is the Deputy Director of the Norwegian Institute for Defence Studies. So our second panelist joining us from Oslo this evening. She's also the head of the Centre for Security Policy. As I said earlier, Katarzyna, you could say whatever you like, but we all know from your research background, that you focus quite a lot on Russian policy. That was mentioned extensively, so we'd be very pleased if you could also comment on that angle. But again, it's great to have you with us. Thanks again for your patience, but now over to you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Perfect. So my introductory remarks, which have already been commented on partly, concern the security and defense aspects of Russia's Arctic policies, which is my job during this panel. and also their impact on the strategic situation in the region. But let me first underline that the fact that we can consider hard security developments in the region does not undermine the importance of other dynamics such as climate change. This is not a zero-sum game, and we should be able to see the various layers of the developments in the Arctic which affect the Arctic deeply in a conjunction. So first, one more general observation regarding the challenge of finding the balance, I think, that we sometimes have in assessment of the security developments in the Arctic, which the report is partly also dealing with. So there is a strong and understandable preference on the part of the international community to see the Arctic primarily as a cooperative space, which absolutely it still remains, as the report also correctly states. But at the same time, it is important, I believe, for decision makers to appreciate the full extent of the competitive dynamics that are ongoing in the Arctic region alongside. And while the increased rivalry, it does not exclude cooperation, as some observers seem to suggest. The point of gravity between cooperation and competition has moved, in my view, influenced by a number of factors happening in the Arctic, but also, of course, outside of the Arctic region, including the military activity in the Arctic, especially the military buildup on the Russian side, and also, of course, spillover effects, which we expected before they actually happened, spillover effects from competition, from conflicts ongoing in other regions, such as, of course, the conflict in Ukraine. And I believe that the Arctic is not an isolated security space. It is likely to get farther intertwined with the supra-regional and global, some of the global issues, as the regions continues to open up for various aspects, various dimensions of human activity. So the report makes a reference to an important problem, I think, that has affected the Arctic narrative, since I have been following this development on a daily basis for well over a decade. And it is that the security dynamics in the region are often presented as a sort of a dichotomy: cooperation and competition, cooperation and conflict. And there is also this long-running debate that concerns the intent and rationale of Russian military buildup in the Arctic, also presented in this kind of dichotomic way. And so one is representing an alarmist position, worried that the ongoing remilitarization of the Arctic has some offensive goals, or as the report called it, more menacing objectives, aimed at winning a potential future conflict that may ensue as a result of Russia's expansionist designs for the region. And on the other end of the spectrum of the narrative is a narrative downplaying the scope and importance of the Russian military buildup, seeing it merely as a moderate and defensively oriented modernization, primarily aimed at constabulary operations, building capability for surveillance, communication, and other means to increase safety and security in the region. And in my view, both these approaches are inaccurate. And the divergent assessments of Russia's objectives in the Arctic often derive from a skewed focus on one side of the picture, and interpreting them as seemingly contradictory aspects of Russian policies, which include, of course, a broad international cooperation, which is still ongoing, as the report also correctly points out, accompanied by a constructive, often constructive and conciliatory Russian rhetoric. But there is also this multi-layered competition and deterrence of potential rivals, which is a part of the Russian policies. So on the one hand, Russia has sharply revamped its military posture, both nuclear and conventional deterrence in all defense branches in the Arctic, especially in the region bordering with Norway, so the western or European part of the Arctic, preparing to meet a very extensive set of threats as seen from Moscow. Some are, to be honest, quite baffling for Western audiences. And these capabilities, they are both offensive and defensive. And I think we should also be careful with underestimating the scale and importance of this development. It's been mentioned, and the report is also dealing with pointing out the frequency, complexity, and sophistication of the military activity that is ongoing in the Arctic. Russia has expanded it significantly in the past 12 years, not just in the past 2 years or since Ukraine. This development has actually a long-term perspective. So, and as a result, Russia's power projection options in the region have expanded together with its ability to control and deny access to various parts of the Arctic region. And again, the report correctly states that the potential for the conflict in the Arctic, and its other panelists have also brought it up, especially conflicts starting in the region, remains low. And this potential, in my view, however, has increased as a result of this competitive dynamics, both in and outside of the Arctic region.
Yep.
So in any case, just want to underline that the cooperation and competition are integral parts of Russian policies. Whether we want to see one part of the picture or the other, we will hardly see one without the other, I think. And contrary to many outside observers, Russia has been perfectly capable of living with this apparent ambivalence in its approaches to the Arctic. And notably, I'm coming to my final remark, Russia has made significant efforts to keep the level of tensions low in the Arctic, to insulate the Arctic affairs from implications, for instance, of its annexation of Crimea. And there are a number of reasons for that, which we can discuss later. But related to that, and this is my last point, is one of the recommendations that the author makes, which argues that it would be useful to resurrect the dialogue with Russia in such forms as the Arctic Security Forces Roundtable, from which Russia has been excluded for its aggression in Ukraine. And the author argues that this would not be a reward for Moscow, nor signal acceptance of its behavior in Ukraine.
Do you think that's a good recommendation? Do you support that?
I think the challenge is how to make sure that Russia does not perceive it exactly like that, like this is backing off. And in my view, such relaxation, if we decide, or politicians, decision makers decide to go this way, there should be some strings attached, for instance, concessions required on the part of Russia, which could include, though not be limited to, some of the more destabilizing policies and behavior of Russia, including in the Arctic region, such as, for instance, unannounced SNAP inspections and exercises,
yep,
which undermine confidence building measures in the region.
Katarzyna, thank you, Katarzyna, but also for setting out very clearly and very succinctly what is, as always with Russia, a fairly multifaceted and sophisticated position, particularly vis-a-vis the Arctic. I found that very interesting. Thank you, and again for your patience. I turn now to my colleague here at Friends of Europe, Alex O'Mahony, because Alex has been monitoring the chat on the social media, the Twitter feed, also what's coming in on Debating Europe, our platform which engages a wider public on these issues. I think Alex has picked up a couple of questions for the panelists, so over to you, Alex.
Thank you, Jamie. Hello, everyone. So first of all, I'll be asking questions on behalf of citizens participating in Debating Europe, the online citizens platform. I have two questions from here. The first is from Barry. So Barry says, we need to work together to reduce the risks of armed conflict in the Arctic region. It should be demilitarized immediately to reduce unnecessary confrontations. Do you think there should be a renewed push for demilitarization in the Arctic? Secondly, we have a question from Catherine, who says the US, the EU, and Russia are already looking to the Arctic region to grab what is there. Do you believe this is right? Are we seeing a scramble for the Arctic and its resources? Finally, we also have a question from a member of our Zoom audience, and the question is, the EU medium-term financial framework will include a modest and first military mobility budget focusing on dual uses infrastructure. Should some of this be directed at least to initial studies of Arctic infrastructure requirements? Thank you.
Alex, thanks very much, and thanks to our citizens, two of them at least, who have intervened. Michael Mann, coming to you, there was a pretty sort of concrete, sort of factual question on the EU financial framework, the military mobility program. Is that all sort of west-east, or does it have a Nordic dimension? So, Michael, hopefully you're still with us. Yes, you are. Excellent. Would you like to take that one on? And then we have the somewhat more general, larger questions on reducing military risks and the scramble for resources, and I'll ask our other panelists to come in there. Michael.
Yeah, thanks very much, Jamie. Can you hear me? Yes.
Yep, and a short answer if possible, because we can then squeeze a lot more in.
I will hold my hands up and say I'm not the world's expert on this. However, I am aware that under the European Defence Fund, there are some projects which are looking into potential research into systems that can be used in extreme climates, including Arctic and Antarctic climates. So I believe that is something that is on the agenda from the member states, and that is something that will be looked into. Could I also quickly answer the one about grabbing the resources?
Yep.
I would say that we can't, no one is going to stop this happening. What the European Union's main interest is ensuring that the utilization of resources in the Arctic is done in a way that is both environmentally and socially sustainable and brings benefits to the people who live there and the indigenous peoples. That is our main concern on that side of things. I hope that was okay.
Absolutely, Michael. Thanks for being commendably brief there. Turner, Norway, of course, has major economic interest in the region. It's a major oil and gas producer these days. It does, I think, mining up at Svalbard, probably lots of other things. Do you perceive that this is developing in, not on behalf of Norway, but at least in the region, into a sort of a scramble? There's been a lot of focus on Greenland, of course, although that's more linked to Denmark historically, with all of its rare earths and so on. So we're good to get your take on that scramble for resources question from Catherine.
Well, I'm not really sure I totally agree with sort of the premises for the question. I would, however, say that I do agree with my colleague from the EU in his response. And it's, you know, it's not like this is an area where there are no rules, no regulations, no systems. But I mean, the challenge is, of course, as the Arctic is more and more opening up, and also as a consequence of the climate change issue, we just need to make sure that we do maintain the sustainability, and that whatever we do in sort of economic development is sustainable and done in an environmental way. And I believe that's also one of the assets. So, for instance, the Arctic Council is that how they can have a constructive role in discussing between the member states issues such as the climate change and the impact of the various economic activities.
Turner, thank you very much. And Mike, looking from your perspective, Alaska also, of course, apart from a home to lots of military bases, a major, of course, oil producer. Do you see some kind of major sort of economic exploitation sort of in the region taking off, or do you think this has been overhyped?
I think it's been a bit overhyped. A lot of aspirations. As the State Secretary just noted, there are rules and regulations in place. I think what has been the big question mark for many people, whether it's the military or economic development, has been the following: that a new ocean is opening, and how we all deal with that through all of the different facets of society. That's been a big question for everyone. So obviously the race to resources comes up. But if you look at what's happening, it's pretty steady. There isn't a giant land grab going on. There aren't oil rigs off the coast popping up because there's a big race going on. It's a lot of positioning. Commodity prices will drive everything.
Patrick,
LNG, oil,
I know.
resources, strategic minerals. Those commodity prices will drive. So if oil ever went back up to $120 a barrel, you might see a different dynamic. But right now it's obviously calmed down. But a lot of aspirations. I think a lot of the narrative around the great race for resources has been around the Yamal Peninsula, Russia's absolute focus on its Arctic, and getting the direct investment from China there. That's played a little bit with the dynamic. But I don't see a giant race for resources. It's new opportunity, incremental opportunity based on commodity prices and the realities of shipping in a still very rough environment.
Thanks, Mike. And Katarzyna, at the end of your intervention, you were talking about the possibility of some kind of agreement with Russia on more military transparency, confidence, security building measures, CSBMs, some kind of military dialogue whereby Russia would also agree to a package of restraint. And Barry's question, quite interestingly, sort of built on your conclusion. Do you see anything happening in that area? Is it being worked? Are there ideas on the table? Is there even a kind of track 2 dialogue going on among sort of security policy experts in the region to sort of map out what a kind of package of risk reduction measures might look like? And Tone, of course, from her perspective in the Norwegian MOD, might have some thoughts on that one as well. But Katarzyna, that seems to be a question naturally for you. So over to you, please.
So, I mean, the general, whether there is a track to, of course, we are discussing a lot the question of how the potential for a confrontation, conflict, misinterpretation of mutual intentions and activity could be reduced. However, but the question was about demilitarization, and I don't think that this is realistic given how the Arctic, I mean, there are nation states in the region, try to convince Russia to renounce its military presence in the Arctic. I think this is not realistic. However, there are a number of measures that could be put in place, and I've mentioned, for instance, the character of military exercises, the confidence building measures that already are in place, like the Vienna document, which have not been particularly respected or evaded by Russia on a number of occasions. I think that some of the capabilities and systems, military, weapons systems that are already there or under development, for instance, long-range precision weapons, and especially Russia's musing about deploying, for instance, hypersonic cruise missiles in the future once they will be available in the region. I mean, these are some of the themes that could be discussed and trying to find in what way we can avoid these scenarios where the security dilemma dynamics, which means basically fueling fears, mutual fears on both sides, could be fueled by this kind of further, military buildup and military increased military presence and activity in the region. So there is definitely a lot of discussion, right? I think Norway is, and the State Secretary is in a much better position to discuss this, but there is a dialogue with Russia to some extent going on. There is a hotline to avoid a solution to avoid misinterpretation. There is also a cooperation going on in other fields. What I was saying is that we have to be careful with taking off the restrictions that were imposed as a response, as a punishment, and as a deterrent for potential future violations by Russia of international law, which could be interpreted by Russia as backing off, getting back to business as usual with, just basically looking away from what happened. So I think this is a danger, and that's why we have to have some strings attached if that would be happening. Thank you.
Yep, thanks very much, Katarzyna. And Turner, any thoughts on this one? I know that from Norway, the balancing act, which you've played very skillfully for many decades, is to make sure that you have a robust collective defence, provided, of course, by NATO, which means some kind of military visibility, but done in such a way as to maintain for so many decades the Arctic as a region of comparative stability and low tension. Do you find that is a balancing act which is still comfortable for you to play, or is it becoming more complicated? And of course, any ideas, if not demilitarization, at least in terms of military risk reduction measures?
Well, I think you sum it up fairly well, the way you just put it, and I basically also agree with what Katarzyna was just saying. But at the same time, we do need to face reality, and as has already been stated, there has been an increased both buildup and activity from the Russian side. That's a fact that we also need to take into account. That's one of the reasons also, as I tried to say in my initial comments, why it's important both that we have the presence of allied friends in our exercises and our training. And it's even more important than ever, I believe, in these days, that we do maintain the policy of the openness or dialogue, transparency, to avoid the potential misunderstandings. But I mean, this whole topic could be a seminar itself. But basically, I think you summed it up fairly well, stating how Norway, for a long time, has been balancing the various factors we need to take into account. And I dare say we have been fairly successful, and there is no immediate plan to change that basic line of policy.
Tone, thanks very much. Dear participants, we're coming to the end of our time, and we have to finish on time. Although let me just also say that the Zoom link will remain open for a few minutes after we've closed the official proceedings and I've left the stage, just in case any of you want to network with each other or have a catch up. Do it on the account of Friends of Europe with our benediction. But as we've got just a couple of minutes left, and I'm going to ask Paul Taylor in just a second to come in, as I said earlier, and give us his sort of takeaways from the discussion. Let me give the audience a final chance if anybody wants to raise their hand. As they say in the auctioneering houses, it's going, gone, so it's now or never. Any raised hands? I turn to the team to see if they can spot anything. No? All right. Well, we've had a good round of Q&A. So, Paul, let me now turn to you to take our event to a conclusion. You heard lots of positive things about your study. Please don't let it go to your head. But I'm sure that they weren't being polite. I'm sure that you've managed to sort of hit the right track. But there were some agreements and disagreements. So over to you, Paul. You don't need to go back to the drawing board and rewrite it, but what did you pick up in terms of at least where you might be prepared to modify your views?
Well, thank you very much, Jamie. Thank you to the panelists for your generous comments, for your feedback. I think that it gave me an appreciation of just how sensitive a line Norway was, for example. In Secretary of State Tone Skagen's remarks, that Norway wants to have a robust defense, it wants the support of its allies, but it doesn't want to be provocative, it doesn't want them to be provocative. Norway tried for a number of years with some difficulty, in fact, to draw NATO's attention to the High North at a time when NATO was only really focused on doing operations out of area in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Libya, and so on. And sometimes you wonder for the Norwegians, is it a case of be careful what you wish for? Because the Arctic is now getting a degree of attention and a degree of rhetoric, which can't always be comfortable, I think, if you sit in Oslo. But I do think, and several of us have said, that the Norwegian model of that mixture of cooperation and dialogue and deterrence with Russia is something that could be more widely shared. The dialogue part of it as well as the deterrence. The fact that you do have open lines with the Russians, how often they're used and on what issues I don't know, but at least they are there for deconfliction, is important. The sensitivity of the question, is there a permanent presence of the U.S. Marines, or is it just a persistent or a rotating presence? Are they based there, or are they not based there? And in fact, I think I wasn't actually recommending that we should have an advanced forward presence of NATO in northern Norway. What I was saying was if Norway felt that would be useful for its security, then NATO should respond positively there. I don't think NATO should come to Norway and say, here, what you need is an enhanced forward presence, 5 miles from Kirkenes. More generally, I'm not sure that Andrew Budd got an answer to his question about how likely are we to be able to keep a lid on this. And I think that's the 64,000 krona question, as it were. I think, though, that sometimes the Russia situation is a little bit overstated in terms of the militarization and a little bit understated in terms of the vulnerability. And the vulnerability of President Putin's big bet on the High North, his economic bet on the High North, could turn sour. And the question is, would a Russia that had invested large amounts of money in a northern sea route and hydrocarbons in the north that turned out not to be very profitable or profitable at all, be more dangerous than a Russia that was successful in those ventures? I'll leave that as a question. I don't know the answer to it. With China, as I say, I think China's role in the Arctic has been massively overstated, particularly by this US administration. And therefore, the fact that they're building one nuclear icebreaker, and it's a long-term project, I don't think really tells us that they want to smash their way into the Arctic and become an Arctic military power. Maybe they just don't want to be reliant on Russian icebreakers for all of their shipping in the Arctic in the future. So, the relationship between Russia and China is, I think, more wary than is sometimes allowed in the suggestion that they are, they should be regarded as one alliance. I heard a British member of Parliament say that recently, and I couldn't disagree more. I don't think they're one alliance. I think each has its suspicions about the others and wants multiple partners. A lot of this boils down in the end to what do we think Russia's intentions are? We can see what its capabilities are, but what are its intentions? And what my report does is to suggest that perhaps we could do a little more to offer ladders down which Russia could climb in the more aggressive parts of its posture if Russia chooses to. But we can't, of course, make that choice for Russia, for President Putin, or whoever's going to be in power after.
Paul, thanks a lot. Paul, thank you very much indeed for bringing that to a crisp conclusion and for giving us your final reflections here. So we come to the end. Let me very briefly, first of all, thank Paul for writing the report and for doing such a fascinating job. And let me again, for all of you, say that tonight's event was not meant as a substitute for reading the report, which hopefully it's whetted your appetite. And that report will be on the Friends of Europe website, so please go and access it. And if you didn't ask a question this evening but want to ask Paul something, his contact details are available and he'll be delighted to hear from you and to respond. Secondly, thank you to our 4 distinguished panelists for joining us and for really living up to my expectations in terms of their expertise and for confirming at least that Paul, even if you don't agree with everything he says, has broadly at least got his analysis right. That's very heartening. Thank you, participants, for also spending an hour and a half with us this evening. Hopefully it's as profitable this time round as on all previous Friends of Europe debating occasions. We will have more for you in the weeks ahead, unfortunately online, at least from my perspective, because it's so great to see you here and to have a drink, as Paul said, and to catch up afterwards, but that's the way we have to operate. Our Strategic Conversations series continues. I'll be interviewing Pedro Serrano of the EU Action Service in the next few days. We'll have our Security Summit and also our State of Europe conference coming up this autumn. And I simply reiterate that for those of you who love us so much that you can't bear to drag yourselves away, the Zoom link will remain open for a couple of minutes for a virtual drink, even if unfortunately we tonight can't offer you the real thing. But it will only be postponed until a happier later date when I can welcome you all back at Town Hall Europe. Again, thank you everybody for this evening. That's the session now finished. Look after yourselves, take good care, and see you at the next event. Goodbye.
And I assure anybody who's still listening that this is diet tea that I'm drinking.